Welcome to the Wild Sacred Journey podcast. I'm your host, Kate Powell. In a world where humans who feel vibrant, whole, and fully alive seem to be increasingly rare, where burnout and brokenness seem to be increasingly the norm, both in individuals and our larger ecosystems, it seems worth exploring how did we get here? And more importantly, what perspectives or what cultural practices or what spiritual, ancestral, or animist wisdom processes might help us stay true to the spark and rhythm of our aliveness on this wild, heartbreaking, but ultimately rare and precious life. Thank you for being here. May these conversations help us to stay human in the face of dehumanizing forces. May they nourish our wild, tender hearts, and may they plant seeds which flourish into a more regenerative and vibrant future. So, welcome back to another episode of Wild Sacred Journey podcast. And I'm Kate Powell. And yeah, so this is another conversation I'm recording, and I'm recording with Anne. And do you pronounce it Ruel?
Yes, Ruel.
Yeah. Okay. Ruel. I always do this. This is like a common theme in all my episodes. I'm like, oh, wait, I forgot to check and make sure I knew how to pronounce your last name properly before we began. Oh, well, here we go. Yeah, so I've got Anne here today, and I'll kind of read you her bio in a moment. But, I have Anne here in part because she's been a listener of the podcast for actually a while, it seems, and which is really amazing. And I'd recorded an episode that I called Wellness World Pitfalls and kind of what happens if we're not doing shadow work along with our quote unquote light work, our expansive work. And, she sent me an email afterwards and had seen an episode or seen a interview with Elizabeth Gilbert talking about purpose anxiety and burnout, and purpose seeking burnout. And um, so Anne had sent me an email because she was drawing some connections in her brain about integration, which I talk about a lot. And I did talk about in that episode about the wellness world pitfalls and shadow work. And yeah, and she was finding she had a lot of questions about integration. And since it is a word that seems to be increasingly thrown out, but we don't necessarily have a context for it or a definition that I think a lot of us kind of get when we hear that word. And um, so if you've been listening to the podcast for a while, you've heard I did some solo episodes that were kind of dancing around the subject a little bit that were kind of inspired by Anne's email. But I'd also thought, what would be really fun is to just actually have a conversation and, maybe hear some of Anne's story about what her journey has been like, not experiencing, when she didn't have integration as an understanding or a framework or a process that was included, and was feeling purpose anxiety, even if she didn't have the word for it at the time. And yeah, and then kind of explore through her story, and which I suspect is pretty parallel to my story and a lot of other people's stories, kind of explore what integration actually means and how we know we're doing it and all of that kind of stuff. So this is a little bit of maybe a different format than some other conversations, but I think it'll be kind of fun and I'm excited. So
I'm excited
um,
too.
yeah, awesome. Thanks for being willing to, yeah, try something new and courageous. And yeah, awesome. So what Anne kind of wrote about, shared as her bio is with over 2 decades of dedicated exploration in healing modalities, Anne holds certifications in life coaching, cacao ceremony facilitation, yoga, and a range of energy healing techniques. And Anne believes that every moment holds its own inherent beauty, wisdom, and wonder, waiting to be unwrapped and witnessed. She's grateful for the opportunity to connect with others and finds joy in inspiring each person on their unique journey of self-discovery and growth. So that's beautiful. Thanks, Anne.
Thanks. Thank you, Kate.
Yeah.
Thanks.
So although you can't tell because of my fancy fake background, I am in the middle of a youth hostel conference room. So I will not be lighting any real candles today, but we're just going to go ahead and just kind of connect with the energy of fire and that sense of just kind of gathering around a flame, which ancestors all around the world have done for so long as a way to, yeah, chat, find knowledge and wisdom, all of that kind of stuff. And Yeah. And so as we gather around that flame, we come into conversation and shared meaning making, which is a deeply, I think, undervalued but incredible way of arriving at wisdom and knowledge. We tend to think of knowledge as being something we read about in books or something passed down to us from somebody who's been ordained in some way with some sort of certification or, um, but our there's also the knowledge and wisdom that comes from sharing our stories with each other and finding the commonalities and the differences and um, yeah, and seeing what comes out of it. So that's kind of what this episode feels like to me. So yeah.
I will agree. Yes.
Mm. So yeah, Anne, is there any way you would like to introduce yourself to people kind of beyond your bio? Anything else you want to share about kind of where in the world you are or where your ancestors kind of came from or, you know, any way to weave yourself into the social fabric of things, whether that's identities or roles or, whatever.
Yeah. I live in Massachusetts in the US. Born and raised here. I'm a traveler, so I've been all around the world, mostly to Europe and to South America.
Mm,
It's one of my passions to travel.
mm,
But I started my journey, I call my healing path with spiritual development with yoga.
mm,
I took my first yoga class, gosh, a couple decades ago, and I just fell in love with it. The moment that I ohmed for the first time felt such coming home to myself. I couldn't explain it. I tried to explain it to my friends and they didn't understand. And so from there, from that yoga, I decided to get a teaching certification. Then I went into Reiki and I learned to give Reiki. Other energy healing modalities like theta healing. And then I got into life coaching. I decided that was something next for me. And most recently, I am doing cacao ceremony facilitation. So I can't say that there's any specific lineages I associate with, but on an energetic level, I've always had this, I don't know, intuitive sense, which I've used throughout my life. And growing up in a family that didn't foster that, I've learned to foster it myself and
mm,
explore and learn.
mm.
So I think that is a good way to, it's a good place to springboard
Start.
from.
Yeah, amazing. I'm curious. So, like, how long was it between starting to practice yoga and deciding you wanted to kind of teach? And then, kind of with in between each of those modalities you've kind of mentioned, how long does that gap kind of,
That was years from the first
yeah.
class to when I took the yoga teacher training. It was because there was resistance there.
Mhm,
I'll be honest, this was back in the 90s, and even though yoga was known about, it was still not as mainstream as it is today,
mhm,
interestingly
mhm,
enough.
mhm,
So my friends weren't involved in it, which meant that I was off on this exploration by myself a little bit and with the people I was taking classes with. So I felt like I was living a double life. I had my yogic life and then I had my corporate job and my friends. So I
mm,
think that's what um kept me from having this, I don't know, what do I want to say, like a bit of a tug of war of being on the mainstream with yoga and getting into yoga teaching and then going into Reiki and other energy modalities, energy healing modalities.
mhm, mhm. How did you find those when they were kind of coming to your awareness? Because as you said, I mean, I think we're bridging it. Some of what you're sharing might not be quite as relevant for folks today because some of this stuff really has taken off in the last few decades in terms of becoming super mainstream and I'll share from the back end of teaching yoga, I mean, yoga studios, they don't make money off group classes. Group classes is actually not enough to keep the doors of the studio open. So most studios solve that problem, quote unquote problem by, the business model problem really by running teacher trainings, because that's really where they tend to bring their money in. And again, there's different business models, but in general,
Mm.
the one that seems to happen the most, at least in the US, is kind of that. And so I'm sort of giving some of this context, I think, for listeners, because I think it's important when we talk about kind of the intersection of capitalism and these things. And, some of the other threads I'm tracking as you're kind of sharing is this sort of, for those of us of European descendancy, or what we might call in these days, like quote unquote, white bodies, we do have this sense of sort of rootlessness in our lineages, and trying to connect in with something deeper does feel countercultural, actually. And we can face some weird backlash, and both from, our friends and our community, and then also now in more recent days, from the communities of the lineages and the ancestry where these practices have come from. So it's, just naming that all of that stuff has created a really confusing, fraught feeling world. And capitalism thrives on that, because if we feel rootless, we feel kind of desperate, and we're more likely to kind of grasp after things and buy things and seek things. And so yeah, so I kind of wanted to like contextualize a little bit some of what I'm hearing, like some of the underthreads of kind of what I'm hearing in your story, because I think your story, well, in some ways it's a little bit different than what people kind of newer to the scene might be finding now, because yeah, you spit and you hit a yoga studio, and it's pretty much guaranteed that yoga studio is running teacher trainings at least once a year, if not twice a year. And most of those teachers, when they come out of those teacher trainings, then can't teach because the studios are just constantly pumping out new teachers. And I say this not like to guilt or shame anybody, but just to name like the ground that we're actually standing on, which is
Yeah.
actually unsustainable. So anyway, so I kind of wanted to just contextualize some of that for folks listening, because, I think your story is, even though it is slightly different maybe than we find nowadays, it is also very common. And to name that there are some of these larger forces at work too in our personal stories, because I think it's so easy to personalize our stories. And um yeah, and to like just remember that there are other forces at work too. So anyway,
And
yeah.
yeah, and I want to add to that was I
Hmm.
took yoga teacher training because I wanted to deepen my practice. It
Hmm.
wasn't with the intention of teach, though I did teach a little
Hmm.
bit afterwards. And I
Hmm.
feel I can resonate with what you're saying because I feel like there's a need for that. There's a need of you don't need to teach afterwards, right? Why don't you
Hmm.
just take this for your own personal development
Hmm.
and see where it brings you, see where it might lead you.
Yeah. And I think that's such an important, thank you for adding that, because I think that's such an important piece, because to me, what that often points to too is sort of this cultural poverty we have around mentoring and and a deepening of things. And the only way we deepen things in our sort of very capitalistic driven world is by like it almost feels like we kind of are opting into this lie that we've sort of been sold, even if we're subconsciously opting in, that the only reason we should spend the time and spend the money on something is if we come out of it with a certification at the end, and some way we can then turn around and start to make money off of it, rather than this actually helps me be more human. And that is a good thing for me and all the people around me and all the non-human, the beyond human kin and beings around me. And um, yeah, so yes, thank you for adding that piece in, because yeah,
Yeah.
that is
And
we.
to add to that, I'm going to keep adding,
Hmm.
it's
Yeah,
that
go for it.
burnout. So that's where I can tell you where began to spin into burnout with spiritual development and
Mm.
and personal development. And I really needed to stop along the way at certain points and be like, what am I really trying to achieve here? I'm continue to get these certifications and learn these modalities, yet I'm not practicing them with people and I'm not bringing them as of a service. So what's going on here?
Mm.
What is my life purpose? And then it just kind of goes in these cycles that feed off of one another.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and again, it's like, so I shared with you before we started recording, and you'll probably hear me talk about this a lot, but Johann Hari wrote a book, Stolen Focus, and I don't know if I'm feeling really kind of bold one day. Maybe I'll reach out to him and see if he'll come on the podcast because I would love to chat with him about this kind of in the context of sort of the circles I move in and the world I'm in. But the premise is that there are actually forces that have been actively working to erode our ability to focus. And and he's sort of defining focus on multiple levels. So there's yes, the focus to get things done, which is the one we're kind of the most used to because again, we in today's day and age, we have a big focus on capitalism and productivity. But there's also the focus it takes to just think deeply about things or to think critically about things. And then he was also identifying that creative non-doing space as also being actually another form of focus and that fruitful inactivity where things are kind of ruminating and digesting and integrating, which I think you're speaking to a little bit there and talking about kind of that pause, like actually sometimes, and that was part of why I'd asked that question, how long was it between those things for you? And so for you, between starting yoga and actually getting your teacher certification, it was, a while. But I think a lot of people listening to this, what I see a lot for people is, you take that yoga class, you have that first like, oh my gosh, this was life changing. And then it's like so many people almost immediately go right to like, okay, how do I deepen this? Maybe I start to become a teacher, and suddenly it's like the pacing goes so much faster. And then, yeah, once we get the yoga certification, okay, now I'm trying to be a teacher or I'm trying to, or now this one door is opened and now I want to, oh, what about this over here? And oh, look, another shiny object over there. And oh, maybe I could follow that over there. And oh, well, and the way I'm going to set myself apart as a yoga teacher is if I can also lead cacao ceremonies and also lead sound baths and also lead tarot things and also, and suddenly more and 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 more because we maybe don't have the tools to actually know how to be good business people if for those of us who are actually then feeling called to try and make a living out of this, so we kind of fill it with more certifications thinking that that's going to solve that problem when in reality we actually need the skills to be a business person. Or even if we're not choosing to try and make a living out of this, it's that it's still just this like yeah, I mean, I think that hunger is so deep in us, that spiritual, cultural poverty is so deep in this day and age, and we're so thirsty and so hungry for it. And it's like we start to quench it and we just get so greedy.
Yeah.
And again, I say that without like judgment or shame. I've done it too, but um and again, I think it's what we're taught, we don't know satiation, most of us. Like we don't actually know. Like I did a whole practice at one point. I spent a whole year just exploring, do I know what satiation is? And I would notice like I knew what too full was and I knew what hungry was, but I realized that satiation wasn't actually too full, wasn't actually satiation, even though some part of me thought it was. And so I had to like really spend time feeling into the space between I'm hungry and I'm too full to find out what satiation was. And then that applies to so many other areas of our life. Do I know when I've had enough social stuff before I start to like freak out and shut down, and have a meltdown? Like, can I like start to actually get those signs that I've had enough? And I think this is kind of bridging us a little bit into integration because I think
Yeah.
this is a little bit of a piece of integration is this question of how do I know when to stop? Because the trick is if we get too full, we actually have surpassed our nervous system capacity for something. So if we're taking training, and the moment we surpass our nervous system capacity for something, we actually go back into desperation mode. We actually kind of go towards disassociation. And then it's like to ground, we try to take in more and more and more, thinking that's going to help bring us down. So we end up in this like feedback loop of I'm hungry. Now I've taken on too much. now I'm going to keep grasping for things because I've taken on too much and I'm trying to desperately bring myself back into my body or get my way out of burnout or find my purpose or, those questions tend to come from a more lost and desperate mind rather than from like a heart and body that are like, I know what enoughness is and I know when to pause. And um,
And
yeah.
what I hear you saying and all of that as well is, who am I? Because
Mm,
that becomes like this never-ending search within all of that. Who am I? Oh, I must be that yoga teacher. Oh no, I tried that on, that didn't fit. I must
mm,
be um, this Reiki master. Oh no, I tried that on, that didn't fit. So, I think as I say this, it's a moment of giving grace. You took that year to consciously and mindfully learn, but where do we actually give ourselves permission or see permission in the outside of us to do that?
mm.
Um, you know, Constant consumption, constant social media. I just get this sense of, unless you carve that out for yourself, no one's going to give you the permission.
Yeah, one of the things I left the book, the Stolen Focus book, with was kind of this renewed dedication to, I mean, he was talking about it's like actually like a focus revolution that we need to have, or what did he call it?
Love
I'm
that.
butchering it. I can't remember. But yeah, basically like if we go with the assumption or the premise, I should say, that there's actually forces actively working to erode our ability to focus, and we consider what that means then for our larger efforts in the world, if we can't focus, we can't take that year to explore what that thing is because we'll get too distracted before enough time has gone by that we've actually learned the lesson, if we can't focus, we can't keep putting pressure on our elected officials to actually regulate the tech industry and how they're designing things. Johan Hari talks about surveillance capitalism. Anyway, we don't need to go down that whole rabbit hole, but it's his point being most of the major changes that have happened societally have been because people were able to actually come together around a certain thing and focus for long enough that they could keep putting pressure on, keep putting pressure on, keep putting pressure on. Because as you said, people are not going to give us permission to do things differently than how the mainstream, how the overculture is currently having us do them. And the idea of slowing down, the idea of knowing what enough is, the idea of, integrating. I mean, our economy would literally collapse if humans actually lived that way. It doesn't mean that we couldn't come up with a better economy that's modeled differently, but based on how it's currently, so I'm not saying it would be the end of society, but it
Um,
would be the end of things as they currently operate for sure.
yeah, and there's examples. I'm sure you could probably point to those examples, maybe indigenous tribes and such, but
Hmm. Hmm.
um, that play a role.
Yeah,
That's what I mean, that's how they survived for so many years.
right, right. I mean, in the grand scheme of things, how we think things have quote unquote always been done is actually like a blip, the tiniest fraction of a blip on the radar, not only of geological history, but even actually of human history. I mean, they've really only been in the last couple hundred years, and human history has certainly, is much longer than that. But yeah, so um,
Well, I can say
yeah.
when it comes to integration, I- it mystifies me. If it mystifies me,
Mm,
it's elusive for me. I feel like I'm not able to grasp it at times, and I'm really curious to find out how you would define it, how you see it.
mm. Yeah. I mean, I think one of the metaphors I kind of use is like digestion, you know, it's like it is. Am I digesting what I've taken in? and assimilating it and allowing myself to be changed by it in some way. If we stay at the surface, I don't think we let things change us. That's one of the things I notice when I don't integrate is I'm taking in information, but only to a certain level. And I'm not like maybe some new neural pathways are being formed, but my body and my nervous system and my soul aren't necessarily being changed by it. Um, so I think that's how it is for me. I'm curious, I'd love to kind of turn that question around for you a little bit too, and kind of see, because especially, so what was the point? Because I know when you shared me like super briefly with me some of your story, you just kind of mentioned there was a point where you realized, wow, I don't think integration has been part of this process for me. And you seem like you felt the loss of that. And so I'm curious what kind of almost the inverse, like if we're defining integration, I think it's also like almost just as important as to say like how we know it isn't happening or like what that loss feels like when we realize maybe we've been missing it. Does that make
Yeah.
sense?
Um, so when I think back about my life and going from yoga to energy healing modalities up to even life coaching certification, there's this sense of loss. Like I feel like there were nuggets of wisdom or life lessons maybe I didn't recognize because I was just going on to um, the next activity.
Mm,
And that sense of constantly searching, I always come back to this. I don't remember the name of the book, but it's, the Dakuko keeps looking. Oh, are you my mother? Are you my mother?
mhm,
Because I resonate with that so strongly of, is this
mhm,
what I am? Is this what's gonna describe me or identify me out into the world? So integration, as I've learned over time, is this process of, oh, something's come up. Maybe I'm on a yoga mat and I start crying or I feel a pain. And I'm like, what is that? Investigating, being curious, which was, I'll be honest, schooled out of me, that curiosity and wonderment
mhm,
of what is
mhm,
there. And so re-educating myself. And I feel that I did that. Like
mhm,
I didn't have a mentor, as you had mentioned
mhm,
before, who said, oh, why don't we sit with this and see what's going on here? It's just something that I played with. And eventually I learned what's outside of me is not what's inside of me. And I do have all the answers within me, and I have everything I need right here, my heart. But I'll forget from time to time. But at least I've learned that lesson and I practice it daily on a daily basis with meditation.
mhm,
So for me, integration is that sense of something's come up, take time to sit with it, journal with it, ask questions, ask my guides maybe. And then, all right, do I feel complete? Can I move on? Is there something more?
mm, mm. Yeah, there's a lot of little threads I was kind of hearing and what you were sharing there. So kind of like, ooh, where do we go? I think some of what I'm hearing and what you're pointing to there too is like relationship. And by that, I mean, again, I think we're supplanting certification for mastery. And we're assuming that because we have a certificate means we've learned the thing, because we've lost the apprenticing model and the idea that, and people hear me talk about this too, and I've talked about this in other podcast episodes a lot, that idea of relationship versus resource, when it comes to kind of if we live in a more animist world, then even these modalities are actually things, they're not resources to be extracted. They're lineages of wisdom, threads of wisdom that have been left, beads, pearls, breadcrumbs, whatever we want to call it, of wisdom that have actually been dropped by the ones who came before that we get to follow. And so by engaging in these wisdom traditions, we're actually entering into a relationship, with an ancestral lineage, with a wisdom lineage, with the other practitioners who are currently practicing that, with the ones who will come after us and will inherit how we've now left the version of the wisdom tradition that we leave them based on how we interact with it. With, as you said, our guides, our beyond human kin that we might access through connecting with these wisdom lineages. So I think it's also like, again, we tend to think of a training as being a thing that we do to receive a certificate or some like quote unquote like learning that goes in our head that then we can regurgitate back or we can share in some way. And I think we've forgotten that it's actually entering into a relationship. And, for me, I think part of the reason I really like that metaphor a lot and I use it a lot to kind of check myself sometimes when this stuff comes up is I'm like, whoa, like what I just did was the equivalent of like barging into a stranger's home and assuming a familiarity or an entitlement to being there that like like I shouldn't like if I actually did that, if I actually walked into a stranger's home, like they would not be okay with that, like that was not okay. And I think yeah, and so I think that because again, I think relationship slows us down if we're concerned about doing it right. I mean, I think relationship is another area where we've become very good at kind of keeping things surface level, hopping from thing to thing, um, moving faster than the pace of trust, because we don't even know what trust and satiation feels like in our bodies, all of that. So again, we're kind of circling around these same themes, just kind of coming at it from different ways. But I think that that's what we kind of need to do actually to understand what these ideas are, particularly for those of us where we have this cultural poverty, where these things aren't talked about. So yeah, I think like I'm hearing, and yeah, a lot of what you share, this question of relationship and and I do think part of that too then is we're used to relational models that are very hierarchical and power over, power under in our culture and in our modern day and age, but particularly again, I think in Western, cultures. Certainly, I mean, we can both speak most fluidly to the US because that's where, we were both born and raised. Um, but yeah, and so I think with that, then we kind of end up in this like when we do try to enter into a relationship, there's so much assumption that we give power away or that and so as you're saying, there's kind of this moment where we have to reclaim like the answers are within me. And yet, on a purely nervous system level, our nervous system knows to seek safety through toggling back and forth between interoception and exteroception or proprioception. So interoception being what's happening inside me, exteroception being what's happening outside of me, proprioception being what's the relationship between me and what's happening outside of me. Like, where am I in relationship to the external world? And so our nervous system knows to toggle between those things. And so that question of like, are you my mother? And then kind of the whiplash of like, oh, whoa, that really like that didn't work out. And then I guess I have to rely on myself. And then, but like, man, that feels like that's a beautiful thing and that's an important thing. And it feels really lonely. And I feel like also leads to burnout because then part of how we know who we are is through the mirroring of other people, the healthy, appropriate mirroring of other people. And so in the absence of that, we're trying to answer a question that I don't think any of us were actually meant to answer. I mean, I literally can't see my own back, like that's that thing you can't ever lick your own elbow, like we actually can't see ourselves fully, both physically and energetically, or metaphorically. And
Mm.
so I think that was the role originally of guides or mentors and apprentices was it wasn't ever about them knowing something you didn't know. It was about them helping you find who you were because we can't find that on our own. But in these capitalist systems, we don't have mentors. So we have to look to people who aren't actually interested in helping. I mean, most people, that's what they think they're trying to do, or with the absolute best intention, that's their intention. But again, the business model, the system doesn't allow for it, because the system says, train people, churn them out, and get the next batch in, you know? And so, and then we live in a culture where we aren't taught those skills on like how to actually mirror someone back to themselves in a way that helps them see themselves more clearly, not as we see them, but, or maybe sometimes as we see them, but as we see them in a way that frees them or uplifts them or helps them refine their seeing of themselves and others, you know? And yeah, I don't know. Does that take you anywhere?
Wow. Yes, it does. I live in I work a corporate job. I have for the same, I've been at the same business for over 20 years. And so I've seen that people coming, people going, and same with like the management. The CEO comes and goes, and they all want to put their own stamp on it, right? And in all of that, what came up for me most recently with this most recent CEO is, where's the time for the seed to grow? And I guess maybe that relates to
Mm,
integration as well,
mm,
because you're implementing these new policies, but you're not allowing them time to actually sprout,
mm,
right? And I think that also plays to going back to these modalities we may have learned, or these certificates we go after is, all right, I have it. I think I received the wisdom I'm supposed to, but I'm not going to sit with it long enough to know. I'm just going to go to the next thing.
mhm,
And I love the piece that you say about relationships, because as I've grown older, I wish for few, no, all my friends are great, but I wish for fewer, deeper connections,
mhm, mhm,
really rich ones,
mhm,
which is interesting because, especially in the US, everything is so youth oriented. I'm
mhm.
not seeing myself on right now, and like sometimes on in advertisements or social media, because I'm wishing for these pieces that really fill me and speak to my heart and my soul, but if they're not being showcased on a screen.
Yeah. I mean, just to that piece right there, um, one of my, I think I think it's Tad Hargrave, who's been on the podcast before, and he's actually my kind of one of my business mentors right now. And so he runs marketing for hippies and looking at ethical marketing and how we restore beauty to the marketplace, basically. And he sort of draws a distinction between commerce and capitalism, commerce being like humans have always needed to make things and barter or sell or somehow exchange the things they make for the things other people make that they aren't making, right? And so the marketplace isn't inherently bad. Like that need isn't inherently bad. Um, but we've suffered such a breakdown of that, and which I think actually also ties into some of this kind of grasping after different modalities. Because if we actually had a healthy marketplace where over here you have the butchers, and over here you have the metalsmiths, and over here you have the tanners and the weavers, and over here you have the candle makers, and over here you have the bakers, and like then and again, for us, we've been sold in these capitalist systems, we've been sold this lie that we need individually to be able to do all those things so that we're quote unquote relevant, right?
Mm.
And like that's fucking exhausting. And also means we're never going to be as good at any of those things as like that baker was who spent his whole life baking, you know? My bread will never be as good as his, if I'm also trying to be the middle, and so there's something too about when we really honored craft and we honored expertise. And so anyway, in one of these conversations, and this is something I've spoken about with some of my friends and we've all kind of been grappling with, is like, again, as we're starting to get older, and there's so much focus on social media right now, and who thrives at that are people who are younger. And also because our culture we've been so trained to look at youth as beauty and as health and as vitality. And we don't have a deeply internalized knowing for what health and vitality and beauty look like in aging bodies. We don't have this sort of sense of wisdom. And so we end up, I mean, I've done this. I've like kind of ended up in trainings with people who I was like so sure that they were like some great person who had something that I like didn't have. No, it turns out they were just young and really good at social media. And actually, like nothing in that was new, you know? And like, and again, like, no, you know, and that's no shade to them. Like, they'll get there. They're offering amazing work, but they're not tested by time. The wisdom, knowledge hasn't become wisdom yet, you know, I think. And that like only happens through just life.
Yeah, it
Um,
does. I think wisdom, that's such an interesting word because do we think we need to achieve it? I think
mm,
it's I have a friend, she says that, she's like, Anne, you're wise. And I'm like, I don't think I'm wise. But maybe because I look at things from a different perspective, or I just have a wider view of
mm,
that.
mm,
And when you're going back to the focus, if you're not taking the time to cultivate a focus, you lack that opportunity to get the big picture.
mhm, mhm,
And I think that's one of the qualities of wisdom.
mm, mm, mm. Yeah, I think you're right. I think it's big picture. I think it's pacing, right? I actually think as you're saying that, I'm sort of finding myself curious. I'm like, oh, I wonder if that, again, if that's some of what, when we talk about somebody's ability to focus and actually do deep thinking, and suddenly deep thinking is considered this rarity in our culture because we've gotten so unused to deep thinking, actually, which is
Gosh.
a horrific thought, but
And
there it is.
just want to tag on that for a moment because
Yeah.
I can remember being a deep thinker in my school days and like being told, "Oh no, like let's move on. That's not where we're going with this." And
Mm.
you know, it wasn't promoted. It wasn't
Yeah.
encouraged.
I remember I would get a lot of feedback on my essays that was like, you need to make a point, Kate. Because I was so busy going like, what about this? And then, oh, but what about this? And then, oh, but what about this? And then, you know, and I was so busy seeing everything from all the angles. And I agree that there's a skill. There is actually a skill that is helpful in navigating the world to like being able to synthesize something down into a point and then kind of being able to make an argument. But this kind of loops back a little bit to what I was saying too about the social media and some of that, the like the conviction of youth that, you know, that we end up finding ourselves compelled by conviction rather than by prevarication and healthy doubt. And that there's something about when people get older, they prevaricate more and they have more healthy doubt. And I think that's a little bit of that wider perspective you're talking about there. And I think there's something about that that also is part of wisdom.
Mm.
And like I remember when I first graduated from my yoga teacher training, man, I graduated so sure I knew how to teach yoga in the best way. And my teachers were right. And this way was the best way. And, you know, and I'm even like a natural, like I'm someone who tends more towards prevarication, like and you know, non-duality, and you know, you can hear that in how I speak and all the my like little web tangents that I go on. But so for me to even feel like I'm sure I was less convicted than some people are, you know, or full of less conviction than some people are because I tend to be less convicted in general than some people are. But Um, but yeah, you know, I graduated with that. And there is, if someone is marketing to you that feels, we mistake that for trustworthiness because it's so, this is the way. And you're like, and especially if you're in that, are you my mother? Are you my mother? Are you my mother place? Like someone shows up and goes, this is the way. And you're going to go, oh, thank God you're here. Show me the way. You know?
Yes.
Take my money, take my power, take my sense of self. You can have it all. Like, just show me the way. You know?
Yes.
And so again, like, so we end up, and then we end up hurt because as as much as that person probably had best intentions, again, most of the people doing that are not intending to become cult leaders, even though that's actually the dynamic that's happening there. It's very similar to cults, you know,
Mm.
but they're not intending that for sure. And some of them may be better than others at saying, whoa, I'll take your money, but I'm giving you back your power and your sense of self and your, you know, but again, if you're young, you literally don't know how to do that because you don't realize necessarily that's what's happening. And they're so busy, or I'm like, I've been there, you know, so busy thinking, oh my God, these people like me. They really like me because you're still in the, are you my mother? Are you my mother? Are you my mother? Only now when you're the quote unquote teacher or guide, the are you my mother becomes like, are you my child? Are you my follower? Are you my community? Are you my tribe? You know, and suddenly we end up in these really very messily entangled, like
Yes. I've seen
dynamics
it.
of everybody needing to be validated by this. And suddenly everybody's just piled their power in the middle of the room and nobody's owning their own anymore. And yeah, it's real messy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, just to take it back to integration for a moment, there was something that I wanted to to ask here. It's for me, I think I said it earlier. It's this mystical grasping.
Mm-hmm.
And as we're going through the process of, are you my mother? Are the answers really inside me? Do I have my own power? I'm not like no one else is going to rule my life or give me the answers. Where, what are the elements or what makes up integration in all of this? Are there specific steps or tools, language?
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I love that question, and you know, I'll take my stab at it. With no claim that this is the be all end all response. And again, and then I'd be interested in hearing too what you've kind of maybe found. But yeah, I think again, I think we go back to so far I feel like we're identifying that pacing is a big part of integration, like slowing down. So I think that's a big step, is like after completing something, pausing, you know, and and then I would say the next step is listening. And we're actually pretty terrible at listening too. And so I think that gets us in trouble a lot at this moment too, because we don't actually know what we're listening to or where we're listening from. And that gets refined too. Like I'm in another stage where, you know, I think when I first started my journey, I feel like the universe was like hitting me with cosmic 2x4s to get me to pay attention, you know? And then as I got better at listening to my intuition and listening to these like nudges from my guides from spirit, you know, as I got better at kind of some of that, it got harder and harder to follow. And so I had to get better at listening. And then I'm noticing recently that now when I ask them for guidance, they're like, mm-mm, you know enough now. Like this is actually like that's actually become another form of giving my power away. And they're starting to call me on that and kind of asking me to step up to take more self-responsibility and to trust myself more, that there are actually no right or wrong choices or paths. And there's just the one I choose and then the consequences of that. And like, can I trust myself to navigate the consequences of being myself? And like,
I just want to repeat that, the consequences of being myself, because I I think you just summed up what I've been going through.
mm,
Like, um, I'm just gonna go with self-sabotage for a moment and how
mm,
I thought myself into an idea, into a concept, and then when the reality came in, I'm like, oh, that wasn't it, and I couldn't control the situation to be what I wanted it to be in my mind and
mm, mm,
my
mm.
imagination. So
I get that. Yeah.
yeah, so hearing what you just said, I'm like, oh, yes.
Yeah, because I think, and I don't want to go too far down another like tangent so that we get lost from that question, because I think you're right on that we need to be kind of handling this question of, okay, so how do we know what integration is and how it's happening? And I think
Mm.
we've made a pretty compelling case for like what it looks like when we don't have integration. But now I think we need to, yeah, I think it's good to start moving the question, the conversation in that direction. But I'll say to that, and I think this will kind of link us back a little bit too, is yeah, everything has consequences, and I remember talking to a client one day and she was like, man, I realized I've been living my whole life like trying to not make ripples. And I'm like, yeah, how many of us do that? Like so many of us all the time, probably especially women, because I think we're socialized more that way, but it's not just, I don't think it's just women, or like we're so again, and this we can link it back. I mean, certainly, again, I think a lot of the blame, although blame may not be helpful, or maybe causality would be a better word, is like can be looked at societally. We live in a justice system that is punitive rather than most of our longer ago indigenous ancestor, more land-based indigenous ancestors would have had very different concept of what justice and repair looked like after rupture. And they would have looked at a crime of some kind as actually being a rupture. And the conversation would have been more, how do we repair this? Which is a lot more what reparative justice is, as a movement, is aiming for in this day and age. But I think there's a consequence to that, which is that we're afraid of consequences. Those of us who live in punitive justice systems are afraid of consequences because we have baggage attached to that word that assumes a consequence will be a hurtful, negative thing. And so we try to live like there are no consequences for our actions. But again, that's like we've cut ourselves off from being part of an ecosystem. There's zero possibility of living within an ecosystem and not having there be consequences to that, and consequences meaning good, bad, neutral, like the whole range of them. And so I think, how I kind of tie this back. Yeah. So I think there's, for integration, I think pausing is an important thing after we do something. I think listening is an important thing. And then I think self-responsibility is actually the next step. Am I willing to be? So I just entered into a new relationship with a modality. There are consequences for that in my body, in my relationships, and in my life, in to this lineage that I've now stepped into, whether I recognized it when I entered into it or not, like I've been thinking about this a lot, as I just spent a week in Ireland visiting with some family over there, and it felt so good to go back. I was, there last year, just about a year ago from when I went back to visit. And, I was thinking about like a phrase that kept coming up to my head while I was there is like these places and these people that lay claim to us. And yeah, so I think responsibility is a part of this because I think we're afraid of consequence and we're also afraid of commitment and like feeling a sense of being claimed by something. And yet, like when we enter into a relationship with a plant medicine, like we're not just taking that to alleviate some symptoms the way Western medicine has maybe more allopathic, cause effect, you know, symptom cure kind of mentality would have us think of it. The plant has a consciousness. The lineage that has developed, the ritual through which and the ceremony through which we connected with that plant has, has a consciousness. And so when we enter into those things, when we drink cacao, we're not just drinking cacao, we're entering into a relationship with her, and we're entering into a relationship with the lands where she's grown and the people who've grown her. And we're entering into a relationship with the colonialism that has tried to disrupt those things and the harm that has come along with that. So, and again, not to say that we can't or shouldn't engage with her, but we have to, like, there's a consequence. And all of that, once we drink her, the energy of all of those things are connected to her presence. And now we've taken her presence into our bodies. And we have to live with the consequences now. We have to let those consequences shape us, change us, move us in different directions. We have to grapple with them. We have to put our own imprint on them. We have to, and so I think yeah. So I guess that's some of it for me. So yeah, so we pause, so again, if we're going to keep this example going of a cacao ceremony, so after we drink the cacao, we pause and then we listen and we acknowledge now that we're in a conversation, that we're in a relationship, that her presence is now present within us and around us. And she's going to have her own opinions and her own things that she's bringing, her own baggage that she's bringing to that, her wounds, her gifts, all of that,
Yeah.
she's bringing to that. And they may not be her wounds. It may just be wounds that are around her because of how we've interacted with her. But, those are still there. And so then I think, yeah, integration is then accepting responsibility in some way for the consequence of entering into that relationship and and letting that change us in some way, as we digest, as we eat things and digest them, our body is changed by what we've eaten and digested. It becomes a part of us, and I think yeah, and so that takes a long time. And you're right. I mean, I think it stirs up. It can show up as tears on a yoga mat. It can show up as feeling really heart expansive. I mean, after a cow ceremony, we leave and we're like, I'm in love with everyone in all of life, right? And like, that's beautiful. And there's consequences to that because sometimes we say yeses that actually might have been no's had we not just drank cacao. And then when we're suddenly not quite as like feeling expansive and full of life force energy, and we're realizing that we might not actually have, the capacity for all the yeses that we said when we were full of cacao energy, then we have to maybe say, oops, now I have to deal with the consequences of, saying yeses that maybe shouldn't, and so we have to, and I think that's part of the integration then of the ceremony is actually learning what are the boundaries, and so some people might say, just keep taking cacao and then you'll keep being full of cacao energy. But our bodies are more finite than these consciousnesses usually are. And so I think that's also part of the responsibility. And then the consequence is like within a finite system that is my body, my physical form, what are the boundaries that then I need to set? Yeah, what are the boundaries I need to set? What are there was like a little connection that hopped in from something you'd said earlier, and then it hopped right back out again. But yeah, anyway, I think I'll pause there for a moment because I think that's kind of a lot. But I don't know. For me anyway, that feels like if I were to kind of break down what integration means to me, whether it's post plant medicine ceremony, whether it's post a retreat, whether it's post, I went on this big 4-month pilgrimage last year, and I feel like it's been a year and well, it's just about been a year since I completed the pilgrimage, and it's just finishing integrating. And so we'll get to that in a moment because that might be another interesting thing to talk about. How do we know when it feels like something is actually finished integrating? But
Yeah.
first, I want to know, like, in all that, like, stuff I just
Wow.
mentioned here, what do you? does that take you, or does that spark for you?
I'm gonna say what I'm taking away from what you just said is boundaries. That is such, especially as a female, what a lesson to
Mm,
learn and to maintain.
mm,
It could be boundaries on your time, it could be boundaries in relationships, being able and capable of saying no. I know that comes up for me a lot because I was, I was raised to say yes and be
mm,
helpful, be that good
mm,
girl, be that good daughter.
mm.
And so the boundary is definitely something that it's a lifelong learning lesson for me.
Yeah.
Um,
That reminds me, yeah. So that's where the leap that my brain was making. Yeah, it was with the boundaries was also then this is part of where that extro and interoception, I think, start to come back into play, and where we get the option of there's the invitation to unlearn these more hierarchical either or relational power dynamics. Because, for me, what it feels like when I work with plants or my guides and I have to kind of have this conversation with clients sometimes and remind them, because I think we can go through a period when we start to open to all of this and we enter into these expansive states, whether with substances and plant medicines or not, even just breath work session or a yoga session, can really take us there. A weekend long retreat that we have this whole big like expansion and then we're
or
like sent
sound
back out into the
healing.
world. Yeah, sound healing
I've
can
had a mis-
really, yeah, it can fuck you up. Yeah. Um, but yeah, so when you know, being human and being spirit means we balance that we are both infinite and finite at the same time. We are eternal and we are here for a millisecond. And when we start to kind of build relationships with these beyond human guides, whether they're plant consciousnesses, whether they're um, gods and goddesses or, whatever they might be, particularly when they're at that energetic level and they don't have physical form, they don't always remember or know what it is to live in a material world that actually has finite resources. So energy is infinite, material is finite. And yes, it's like cyclical in the sense that, matter can either be created or destroyed, blah, blah, blah. But again, the pacing question, right? Like this is a question of sustainability. And so it's the same when we work with plant consciousnesses, the plant medicines consciousnesses, they're energetic, but the plants themselves are actually finite resources in the same way our bodies are kind of finite resources. And so the same questions of sustainability start to come up. How is our pacing maybe not honoring that we're finite? And so sometimes too, we actually have to, like, this is part of where we have to reclaim, not give away our power, even to these energetic beings that have our best interests at heart. I mean, I sometimes have my guides that'll be like, you should go do this. And I'm like, yeah, with what money? I'm like, sure, if you really want me to do it, then that money needs to show up in my inbox tomorrow somehow, and I'll go do it. But, like, or just like, setting things like, okay, I hear you. I'm not saying no, but not today, because today I'm tired, or whatever that is. And so this is part of that boundary question is like, I think that knowing how to set boundaries, even with our beloved guides and these beautiful expansive states, and that more is not always better. And I would say that that's another big piece of the integration for me is that, and that satiation, that question of satiation is like, at what point is the more actually becoming detrimental rather than better? And that even means in our connections. I mean, the same way I love my friends and family and I need a lot of alone time. I love my
Yeah.
guides and I also still I get to say, you know,
And I love cacao. That doesn't mean sitting with cacao every day is like it's going to be the right decision for me because then that becomes a state of I lose that what's Right. Spiritual connection. I lose sacred. I
Mhm,
lose the sacred connection of it.
mhm, mhm,
And and then I'm kind
mm,
of disassociating. I'm getting a little numb. Oh, it just becomes an everyday activity.
mhm, mhm. Yeah, I love what you're pointing to there. I also notice when I work with plant medicines, because it tends to go in phases for me, where I'll kind of work with them pretty fairly intensely for a little while, and then I'll take a break and integrate for a little while, and then I might come back. And not all of them, but that's just kind of sometimes how it goes. And one of the things I notice, part of how I know in those moments when I need to pause and integrate, is that I can't feel the resonance of the plant anymore.
Mm.
And and I think some of that's, it's like, it's again, it's like my my energy fields, my system, my personal system is actually so saturated with the frequency of the plant anymore that I've ceased to be able to distinguish it from me. And that's not a bad thing, but it's just usually a sign that then it's like, and I think unfortunately in our more and more and more world, when we reach that point, we think, oh, I can't feel it because I just need to take more of it to feel more of it. And, I do some work sometimes with hape, and I made that mistake a couple times. And then my system got like totally fried because I was taking way more hape than my system actually needed. And I was like suddenly finding myself jittery and anxious a lot of the day. And I was like, what's going on? And then I realized, like, oh, I'm out of alignment with myself. I'm actually now out of alignment with the plant because we've fallen now into addictive and abusive behavior, not intentionally, but and not saying I couldn't stop, but just that is actually what that pattern is, of just constantly upping more and more and more to feel something. That is,
Yeah.
that is what that is. Um, and so I'd have to back off and sort of say, okay, right, sorry, you know, and then let the integration process. And so I think too, maybe another way of looking and defining integration is, this is just coming to me as we're speaking. We have this peak experience, which in many ways is a merging of ourselves with something new, right? Like whether it's ingesting, whether it's going on a retreat, whether it's taking a, experiencing a sound bath, taking a yoga class, whatever it is. And then integration is actually the process of assimilating it and um, like actually then untangling ourselves from it again,
Oh, I love that piece, the untangling.
so that we start to recognize, so it's like we come together and then we let ourselves be changed by the encounter. And then we go, okay, back off, find some space, find some space, find some space. Who am I now that I've been changed by this encounter? You know, and we don't get to ask that question if we're just continually encountering. you know?
Yeah. Or remembering or trying to get back to that space. I know when I've done plant medicine,
Mm.
I'm like, I want to get back to that space without the plant,
Yes.
right?
Right.
Um,
Yes. That's so
so,
key. Yeah.
and I think
Sorry.
hearing what you just said, that was an entanglement of of
Mm,
of ways of then lacking an integration of it or stunting the integration process because I'm constantly trying to go back to that space, which just keeps me wrapped into the energy of the
mhm.
plant.
Well, and it keeps us from skill building, because I think that's the piece of some of this too. They're showing us a potential that exists in the field that we are not yet embodying ourselves. And again, whether it's the plant, whether it's a beautiful yoga practice, whether it's a sound bath, whatever it is, my pilgrimage that I went on last year, I mean, I set myself up for it through a lot of intentional work and laying a lot of intentional groundwork to enable me to go on this pilgrimage in a certain way. But the version of me I found last year on that pilgrimage utterly surprised me. It was not what I expected at all. Very pleasantly surprised me. And then, man, I got knocked out of that so fast. And it's taken me a year. And I would say it's only been within the last 3 or 4 days that I've started to find my way back to that again. But it took a year of being lost and feeling more lost than I did before I went on the pilgrimage. It didn't just knock me back to before the pilgrimage. It knocked me back to like 13, 14 years old. Like it knocked me way back. And then it's been slowly reclaiming, okay, what was that thing that I learned there that I really liked that, okay, now how do I apply that here? How do I find that again? And just constantly working towards that. What are the skills that it's going to take, And so now I can see looking back how even though I felt like I'd stepped into this like massive, amazing realignment, and I had on one level, there was still this under layer of me that wasn't aligned with that yet and was still aligned with some old patterns. And so then I got knocked all the way back to those old patterns and have had to just like slowly inch by inch by inch by inch by inch, like crawl my way back to where I was. But now that underlayer has completely changed. So now as I find myself closer to something similar to where I found myself last year, it's even that's different now because the underlayer is different and is going to be much more solid of a support for that piece of me I found unexpectedly.
Mm.
So when cacao bursts our hearts open, beautiful, but actually living with our hearts open like that it's not because of cacao. She's just reminding us of our own potential to live with our hearts open like that. And so to be reliant on her to get us there is actually an addiction. It is actually a substance abuse question then, because we're not, again, there's that lack of responsibility, you know? Um, I mean, and again, if you think about it like a friend, I don't know how to be happy, but when I'm around this friend, I always laugh. So I'm just going to keep being around that friend every time I need a laugh. And again, there's a certain amount of that that's okay. But I mean, eventually that friend can feel if you're just like the Debbie Downer who's always leaning on them, trying to like, suck their happiness to find something, and they're going to stop hanging out with you, you know?
Yes.
And, and so I think the same thing can happen actually with these. That's when we know we're not in right relationship with the modality or the plant medicine or the wisdom tradition, the practice is when we're relying on it to bring us to a state that we aren't making any effort to find for ourselves. It's one thing to use it as a reminder, because sometimes we need that attunement the same way we'd go to a friend and be, or a practitioner of some kind and be like, hey, I'm having trouble finding that frequency again, but you hold that really well. Can I sit by you so that I can remember what that frequency is in my system? Like that's that's that mentor apprentice relationship, not the like
Yeah.
savior victim relationship.
And what I'm also like, it's an agreement relationship as well, what I'm hearing
Mm,
as well.
mm, mm,
So I want to say something about the integration and the loss because I've been in that state of lost
mm,
after um, a sound bath or doing some heavy expansive energy work and then coming back. Because like the energy wave, it collapses and you're
mm,
coming back into the matter state. And
mm,
now you're like, literally, I'm like, I think I'm having a psychotic break because it's
mm,
almost like the two can't having a difficult time merging back into each other. And then I
mm,
get a little lost and a little confused.
mm,
So I can speak to what I've done is I've had to sit with that. And I've like spoke to a friend to get some sense of, okay, I just need to talk this out to see what comes out of my brain because sometimes it's these different threads that are spinning and maybe they need to be woven in together, but I don't know that until I have a conversation with someone or even if I put a pen to paper and start journaling. So for me, the sense of integration also relies on something of a conversation,
mm,
be it on paper or with someone else. And
mhm,
then I feel less like, okay, I don't need to go to any kind of institution or like seek any sort of help in that regard because this is natural. It's just I didn't have a mentor or, I didn't go through an apprenticeship to learn that process.
Mm, mm. Yeah, I mean, I love what you're speaking to there because yes, yeah, I think there's like, there's often a huge gap between, and I think the longer we do this work, the more we can go into those spaces and not experience as much of a gap and not be kind of like knocked
Mhm.
back quite so far. Um, Again, partly because if we know satiation, like I know I'm massively sensitive. So if I'm ever sitting in a plant medicine ceremony, I'm usually starting with way smaller doses than most of the other people around me. And in part, that's because I actually have learned what satiation is. And I actually suspect most people are taking doses that are more aligned with assuming overly full is what we're trying to get to rather than satiation. um, and again, I'm not, no judgment, no shame, but just, just naming patterns that I see. Um, so some of that is like actually knowing how to titrate more, knowing that I actually need less of a peak experience to have a deeper transformation because too much peak experience actually becomes harder to integrate because the gap then becomes between where we were and what we found in that moment becomes so much bigger that then it does feel almost impossible to assimilate once that energy wave comes crashing down, like you've said. And it can lead to us feeling like we're crazy, like we're psychotic, like we don't know where to go, like we're super lost, all of that kind of stuff. And without the right mentors, without the right tools, that's a rough place to be. And how many people do then end up actually getting medication for it because they don't know what else to do? So some of the things we can reach for in that moment can actually end up, I mean, again, I'm not going to say anybody's making right or wrong choices for themselves, but just knowing that some of the things that we reach for might hinder the integration process actually, because we're trying to put the lid back on Pandora's box. And we're like desperately trying to like, whoa, 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 and then we never want to try any of it again. I mean, how many people go to
Yeah.
a sound bath, get broken wide open, and then are like, that's it for me, not doing that again. Like that was too much. Um, yeah. So I mean, I've definitely, and I think too, as a practitioner, when I was newer to it, I probably led people to more of those types of experiences because as a practitioner, I actually didn't know what enoughness was. Okay, so some Wi-Fi issues there. But yeah, so as a practitioner, when I was first starting out, I didn't know how to titrate that for people. And so I think I totally know that there were some sessions where I blew people way too wide open and it totally freaked them out. Or I took them somewhere that was actually too deep for them in that moment. Um, and so I think again, when we were kind of talking earlier about sort of, when we fall for those sort of like the youth and the beauty and the conviction of kind of the younger practitioners, yeah, there's again, like not that they don't know their stuff, but there's a risk there because the skill of actually facilitating those spaces for other people, um, that's the understanding the process of integration and that the what happens in that gap between what people find and where they were before they found it and how to help them bridge that gap in ways that is more easily digested. That's something that, again, most trainings don't actually teach because that actually only comes with time and, realizing how potent you are. Most of us don't realize how potent our presence actually is because we've been taught to undervalue ourselves. And yeah, anyway. um,
Yeah. I,
yeah.
I just wanted to go back because I the piece about burnout and finding your life purpose.
Mm,
And having this conversation with you, I'm starting to wonder, and not to go off on these threads, but it just starts me to think about whatever led us to this, what systems led us to believe that we had to find our life purpose, that did it become something of a journey for ourselves? Was it marketing? Was it
Mm,
commercialization, consumption, and those types of things? Or was it the lack of relationships, being
mm.
in community and those kind of connections? So
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. And I don't know that there's one easy answer. I suspect we could probably answer that question from a lot of different directions and a lot of different lenses. From where I stand, I would, I mean, I think it's kind of like with most things. I think there's like the gift and the wound that nestle right next to each other, right? And so I think humans have probably always, I think humans have always wanted to be a contribution.
mm,
Um, I think finding meaning and purpose and contribution are innate to being human for most humans. I think there are a very few number who maybe don't feel that, and I think that's who we nowadays would call sociopaths. But and so I do think there probably are some who experience that differently. At least we should say. Maybe I shouldn't say that they don't feel it, but they experience it differently, maybe than the majority of us. But so I don't think that the question itself is wrong. I think it's just that where we've been taught to seek the answers has gotten distorted. And that's where, yeah, I think capitalism is a big piece of it. I think you're right. I think the lack of elders and relationship and community is a big piece of it. Um, yeah, I would say those, from where I stand, those seem like the two biggest pieces, because I think those are the pieces that would the community and the elders and the relationship kind of helps us remember that our purpose is to just be in relationship, like to play our part in the ecosystem of things, to express ourselves and to try and do so beautifully in some kind of way, with grace and beauty in some kind of way. And to notice our gifts and to try and share those and contribute those, and but again, we're not so good at seeing our gifts. And I don't think we're meant to be, because the things that we're actually good at are the stuff that to us is like breathing. We just do it
yes.
automatically. So we actually don't see it. And um,
Can I say something here? Because
yeah,
it's something
please.
happens at work, which, okay, I work in a corporate environment, and to have a colleague, actually more than one, say to me, "And you're so calming. You're the calming one on our team. Like,
Mm,
you just, thank you for just having patience and being calm." And I'm like, I'm a calm person. Like,
uh-huh.
so to hear that and to know that the work that I've done in my own life for spiritual development and personal development is now being seen in
Mm,
my corporate job. It's like, all right, I've made an
mhm,
impact.
mhm.
And that meant a lot to me, just to hear someone say, "Well, you're calm. You're the one who brings the calmness to the team." And I'm like, "Okay, thank
And
you."
I think some of what's beautiful too there about what you're pointing out is the other piece of this is we don't get to say what our purpose is, because people will take how we left them feeling and they'll run with it in whatever direction they run with it in, I have had that happen so many times, either after a yoga class or, a friend of mine recently who I was in conversation with, she was like, "Oh, you said that one thing to me that one time, and that opened up this whole journey. And I am where I am today because of that one thing you said that one time and everything I've done since then." And like, you can't bottle that. You can't put a certificate on that. You couldn't recreate it if you tried, because purpose is relational. So it's co-creative, And so I was just being me. in response to how she was being in that moment that I said the thing that I said. And then she chose to take the thing I said and follow it. And, so yes, some of that's because of me, but a lot of that's also because of every choice she's made since then, which is still actually all about her and has nothing to do with me. And yet at the same time, you can't totally separate those out because we're all one. So, like,
Yeah.
yeah, our purpose is it's co-created actually, and like
And
you said, you do your work over here and then it affects how you show up in your corporate place. And then
mm,
other people are responding to that, but they're responding to it in the way that they respond to it. And they're going to see you how they see you. And is that your purpose? Yeah, probably partly actually. And, people will sometimes see things in us that are uncomfortable for us, like that might be a little bit more of a projection because it's something that they're wanting to see in themselves. And so they're seeing it in us, and it might not be how we define ourselves, but it's how they see us. And like, that's not always comfortable. And that's also not separate from these conversations of what our purpose is. Um, but yeah, you can't capitalize on that.
no, you can't. I think that's great. I'm glad we went there with that little piece.
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
that's also important is purpose cannot be capitalized. Yet we've somehow believe it have put a belief in the system that it is.
Mm. I mean, and I think some of that is the downside to this wanting to be, um, I think this was like a conversation I was always have with my mom, where she would kind of be like, I wish you could just get a job and just any kind of good job and like let that make you your money and then like have your hobbies, like let that fund your hobbies and the life that you want outside of work and like not need your work to be meaningful. And I think some people can do that, and that's great for them. I am not one of them. And I also think too, there's an erosion of free time in our culture that's happening where the corporations and companies are demanding that they become the primary focus of a person's life, which then, if that's the system that we're living in, then yeah, I fucking want what I'm doing to be meaningful and purposeful. Because if I'm expected to give 80 hours, 100 hours a week to it and have all of my relationships and personal life suffer and have no time for hobbies outside of it, then yeah, that's putting a lot of pressure on the what we do to be our purpose. So I think if we also didn't have to work as much,
I agree.
we might find that our purpose became less entangled with what we do.
Mm.
Um, so I suspect that that's part of it. And that is also, I think, a little bit of a shadow side of something that I think in more modern times, we tend to put a lot of emphasis on having our work be meaningful. Um, and like, again, maybe it needs to be, and maybe it doesn't always need to be. But I suspect some of that desire to have our work be meaningful is also pointing to this breakdown of the marketplace and the lack of beauty and meaning in the marketplace. And that if the marketplace were full of more care and beauty and ethics and relationship, then purpose would more naturally feel like it was happening there, even if we weren't equating it with what we do, per se, if that makes sense.
That makes so sense. I think that was very eloquently laid
Lovely.
out.
I love when that works out, when all my weird tangled thoughts like somehow come out semi-eloquently. So I'm aware of our time. And speaking of titrating and nervous system, this has been
Yeah,
like a really potent conversation, I feel like.
it has.
Um, so I want to like not, I feel like we could probably keep talking for forever, but I also feel like, again, that's going to really quickly tip into probably too much.
Yes. But
um, for both of us as well as for people listening. But yeah, so I do think though it would be important before, as we're kind of wrapping here, to maybe tap into that, like how do we know when integration has happened or is done? Um, and
can I start with
yeah, please.
I I'm still trying to figure that out for myself.
Hmm. Hmm.
I know I've seen it happen, but I can't pinpoint it Like I couldn't put like a stake in it and say, oh yeah, that's where it ended. That's where, so
Yeah.
that's my answer.
Yeah. And I think that you're pointing to something there though with that, because I don't know that it is an arrival destination, because I think, as you know, our language has reflected in this conversation, it's a process. And again, when we know at the level of energy, time and space aren't linear. So there's also, and even progress isn't linear, like even non-energetic progress isn't actually linear because all of it moves in cycles and spirals. So I think yeah, and I think sometimes we'll be integrating one thing, and part of the integration, something else will open. And then that the first piece might complete, but it's taken us to this next thing that's already kind of started and is ongoing. So it is really hard to put a pin in it. I do think the slowing down, though, is an important part of that, because I think if we're moving too fast, we will miss some of those subtle it. I don't know, the image that's coming to me right now is just like the waves with the ebbing and the flowing, and then sometimes the tide is in and sometimes the tide is out. But then even within, when the tide is in or the tide is out, there's still a general ebb and flow that's happening. And so I almost wonder if maybe that's like a good image for integration. And so there's the larger cycle of the tides in and tides out that's happening, and then there's the smaller cycles of each individual kind of wave coming in and out.
Yeah.
And so I think slowing down so that we can sense the subtleties of that. If we're moving too fast, we're not able to actually track where we are in the wave of it and in the cycles of it. I'll say with this piece, with the pilgrimage, and kind of within just the last couple of days, how I feel like last year's trip has really actually finally come to integration, which isn't to say that everything from it is complete, but there's something about it that feels integrated, so that now whatever happens from here is kind of happening from this point. So there's something there that and this point being that built on the other point, but its own point. So there's something there maybe about timelines and how if we have a huge expansion, it's almost like we've leapt forward in time, because it's kind of like we've arrived at a version of us that we haven't yet learned to embody. And the integration is then like letting the who we were before that moment catch up to who we found out we could be.
Yes.
So I think that might be one way of noticing when integration is done, is that it feels like I'm caught up now. Whereas before it felt like I was sort of out of time, like, and there was a part of me that was over here, and there was a part of me that was back there, and there was a part of me that was right here, and they weren't all like, they hadn't kind of met yet. So there's almost, and this kind of takes me to this other point, which is like a lot of times we think of rupture as being trauma or as being a quote unquote bad thing, but actually, what if peak experiences are also ruptures? And they're a rip in how we've seen ourselves, how we've operated prior to this, how we've our relationships that are founded on who we used to be. And so integration then is like the repair of, but not because we're putting the Band-Aid back on, but because we're okay, like, when you're building a muscle, you rip the muscle and then the muscle in the reparative process gets stronger. So I think that's some of what happens in these moments too. And so integration is kind of the repair that is the muscle getting stronger, or we've like fragmented ourselves. We leave a peak experience fragmented, actually. We often feel more whole in the moment because the version of ourselves, the possibility for ourselves that we've discovered in that moment is a more intact one than who we were before we entered the peak experience. But because like we were talking about earlier, that gap between what we found out was possible and how we were living before might be large. And so there's actually fragmentation there that's happened. And so we're having to kind of find a way to reconcile those pieces, at least for now, knowing that it's going to be an ongoing process, probably forever. But there's a moment where, yeah, so I would feel like within the last couple days, how I know some of it's just an intuitive gut thing. Like there was like literally this voice in me that was just like, yep, okay, that's done. We're reborn now. And what's happening from here on out is now its thing. And I'm like, oh, okay. But it feels like I'm caught up. The pieces of me are kind of put back together again in something that resembles now a mix of who I was before my last trip, who I found on that last trip, and who I am now.
Mm.
And if we're thinking about it in terms of energy, sometimes to me that almost feels like a sound, like a certain gong or certain like just kind of some vibration of intactness and completion that feels like, ah, here's that moment. Um, yeah. Yeah, I think that's what I've got right now.
I followed all of that, so you know.
Okay, good.
And it makes sense to me because that first future version of yourself, you're not there yet, but you can
Right.
see.
Yes.
And then when you do arrive at that point, there is, and I've had it in my own personal experience, there is this like sense of I'm gonna say my chakras or energy centers align. That's the way
Yeah.
I notice it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And I think that's part of where we make the mistake of thinking it's a wham bam, thank you, ma'am, done deal kind of thing. We go to the peak experience and now we leave transformed. And it's like, no, we were just shown a potential. A
Mm.
potential was seeded in the quantum field for a way of being that we're not yet fully inhabiting, or we haven't yet fully inhabited. And now we have to live up to that potential if we decide that we like that and that's where we want to go. Um, yeah. And it is, I agree. I think it is. It's this sense of alignment that feels like a completion.
Mm.
And I think it's important to note we can feel that in one area and still be a work in progress in another area, you know. Um, yeah,
Such a juicy conversation.
I know. Yeah, I mean, I have a feeling, I have a feeling this will resonate with a lot of people, and I hope that it does, because I feel like this is a conversation that's actually really missing from a lot of these spaces, and it's just so huge for um,
It is because we're all trying different modalities, different tools, different experiences. And, I have obviously a different life experience than you, but we've had similar stories.
mhm,
And it feels less lonely to have this conversation. It also gives me aha moments and
mm,
oh yeah, something I want to go and like think on later, like
mhm.
put thought into later. So I love these deep conversations. This is
Well, and for me, this feels like this is also part of the revolution that's needing to happen right now. Like if we're talking about, because increasingly I think of my work less as healing work and more as culture work, because
Mm.
so much of what we actually are being wounded by is a cultural poverty, is the way our culture is currently functioning, which is to say it's uplifting capitalism and, all of these other things that are like we talked about earlier in the conversation that are actually like actively detrimental to our humanity, are actively detrimental to the sustainability of our bodies and the other finite resources we engage with day to day, are actively detrimental to our ability to slow down and be in relationship and practice deep listening and take responsibility for our power. And, and so, which isn't to say we need to like give away our power to the idea that these large forces are, actively working against us, but just that, the how we do things is just as important as the what we're doing. And so we can be doing all of these beautiful modalities, but if we're doing them from the same cultural perspective that has been wounding us in the first place, they're only going to be so beneficial. And we risk actually harming the wisdom processes, the wisdom traditions, and leaving even more fragmented wisdom traditions for the ones who come after. So for me, I think this idea of culture work is actually a direct result of my integrating the work that I do, not because I understood how to think, quote unquote, more indigenously when I entered into this. I entered into this with my Western capitalistic mind, but then I let the modalities that I was engaging with change me. And along the way, I realized that in order to be in right relationship with them, I had to look at how I was showing up for that relationship and where I was out of alignment with that. And, you know, I feel very fortunate that I was able to find practices that had enough intactness that they could show me that. Yeah, but some of that's also, I think, just kind of this, yeah, just my own kind of, I think, sort of somewhat intuitive sense of where to go that wasn't conscious at all, but was somehow kind of guiding me to like, take this in, let it change you, integrate it,
Yeah.
don't just move on to the next thing, and let this work you for a while. And if you let it work for you for a while, you'll find out that you might not need as many of the other things, because this has been plenty.
Hearing you say that reminds me, I consciously, it's been over a year, actually it's going to be 2 years, consciously chose to live my elder years in a different mindset. And I went through a year of being with the crone and I circled with women monthly so that we could develop our crone years and we could step into that power and step into that archetype. And that was a choice. But I didn't, hearing you speak, it's like, well, that could have been an integration process because it came to me intuitively, but it could have been some work I had done throughout my years. But just to sit and consciously say, I want to live my elder years in a way that's different from what I see in my family, and the women in my family. That's been huge for me. And now I'm gravitated to other women who are stepping into their elder years in the same way, consciously looking to bring the crone to a more positive I don't want to say in the media, but like bringing it more out there, bringing it as opposed to keeping it in the dark or saying, oh yeah, you've hit a certain age, you've got so many gray hairs. We're just going to push you aside. Where these women are, let me be a little louder. Let me show you a little bit more of me, or a little bit more of what my offerings are.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
So yeah, is there any last like question or any last anything to kind of that you're feeling needs for completion for this for now?
I feel that again, I can't wait to listen to this back because there's so many little jewels, and I just want to say I'm honored that you asked me to have this conversation with you. Thank you so much. There's so much richness in the soil that is planted here. That is that I'm looking forward to seeing what comes after.
Yeah, thank you. Well, thank you for saying yes and for sending that email in the first place because yeah, it's funny. For a long time, I hesitated doing solo episodes because like I much prefer conversations. And even at one point in time, I had the opportunity to do a yoga class for like a TV show, like a local TV station. And I finally had to tell him, like, I just don't think I'm the right person for this because the studio wasn't big enough for me to have students in there. I was like, if I could be teaching to bodies, you can record me, that's fine. But if there's no bodies there, then I'm just monologuing. And that's like that's not my thing. Um, so I resisted for a while, but then I've been enjoying doing the solo episodes, but it was really nice I love when I hear from people that they're listening to it, that it sparked something for them, because then it helps me feel the conversation that's actually happening there more directly. Um, yeah. And then again, yeah, I mean, like I said, after you said that, I was like, well, I mean, I could respond to this just by myself, but I actually think we'll have a much richer conversation if you're here and we can actually talk about it without me assuming I know exactly what your story is or what you mean by the questions that you're asking, or, because there's so much assumption there otherwise. Um, and then, yeah, getting to hear your take on things and then getting to have your questions kind of deepen my responses. And yeah, this is how conversations can go. Which seems crazy that we actually have to like remember how to have conversations these days, but I actually think we're rapidly losing that art as well. Yeah. The older I get, the more countercultural I realize I am. Like, yes, viva la revolucion. One conversation at a time.
I'm
Um,
happy to be this conversation.
Yeah, thank you. It
You're
was made
welcome.
the richer for having you here. So I really appreciate you being here and being part of the inspiration for it. So, and what's cool too is, I mean, who knows, like for folks listening to this, if you hear an episode that, and you end up with questions, like email me and then maybe we end up having a conversation on here, and so it would be kind of cool if this could actually this was really fun. And, if this kind of becomes a format, that's awesome too. I'm open to that. So yeah, great. Well, yeah. So we'll say, yeah, this was a lot. And so, I've had podcasts where I've had to listen to them before. It's funny to say this now at the end, but where, I had to pause like partway through and just keep coming back to them later and sometimes re-listen to them multiple times. So, if for anybody listening, if you're feeling the need for that, like please by all means, do that and let it integrate. Yeah. Well, thanks, Anne.
Thank you,
And
Kate.
yeah, to everyone listening, please, like, again, too, if you found a lot of value in this, like share it. This is, as we've talked about, I think this is a conversation that isn't happening enough and will need to happen more as more and more of these modalities become mainstream and as it becomes more normalized for people to start reaching out. And there's just so much anxiety in the world right now about so many different things. So from that space, we're primed to just reach, 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 reach. And, um, I really think that this is kind of the antidote. These types of conversations, some of the ideas that we were exploring today can maybe point us towards an antidote for that, because the more we keep reaching, the more anxious we're actually going to feel. So, um, yeah, for anybody listening who is resonating, you probably know other people who would resonate with this. And so, yeah, feel free to share it. It really, um, yeah, really helps. hopefully. That's my wish for this conversation anyway. So yeah, for those of you listening, we'll see you next time around the metaphoric fire. Thanks for tuning in.